And what I'm going to try and do is to just have a quick oversight of some of the complexities we're dealing with in hydraulic fracturing in Alberta. Other speakers will get into more detail on different things, but I'm just going to try and cover the overall complexities. And why it's so hard for the industry to communicate about them as well. Because it's very easy to communicate something relatively simple like drilling a well, but communicating about hydraulic fracturing is much more difficult. So I'm going to cover just a quick summary of a number of different issues and why it's more complex in Alberta to do that communication, and a bit of assessment of where do we have to go in the future as far as the industry related to hydraulic fracturing. So first of all, this is AER data from actually June 2013. Hopefully we'll get an update on this, but if you look at what's been done in Alberta, there has been a lot of hydraulic fracturing. 167,000, it's probably already up to 180,000. A lot of it's happened just recently. 19,000 coal-bed methane wells have been hydraulically fractured, but they were done with nitrogen. So that sort of leads into one of the key issues with fracturing is that not all fracturing projects are the same. Not all of them are horizontal. All the CBM wells are vertical wells. Most of them that have been, all the ones that have been fractured pretty well have been vertical wells, mainly being done with nitrogen, so not water. So the key thing here is that there's a lot of different formations in Alberta. They all need different fracturing technologies. They use different fracturing technologies, so they have different impacts from an environmental point of view. If you look at the different formations in Alberta, we have a lot of different formations. A lot of them are producing oil, some of them are producing gas. We just talked about tight oil. The Cardium is the number one for that. You can see the green bar is the number of Cardium horizontal wells that have been hydraulically fractured in Alberta. So the Cardium is actually the main formation that's seeing hydraulic fracturing technology applied to it. But a lot of people don't really hear about it because the Cardium is just an extension of a conventional oil field that's been operating since the 1950s. So it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's actually where most of the action is. But who's aware of that? You have other formations. These are going from the shallowest formation to the deepest formations. Everybody's talking about the Duvernay, but not a lot's been done there so far. So again, it's a new formation. It's huge, but just because there's a resource doesn't mean it's going to be drilled, and it doesn't mean it's going to be economic. And that means it doesn't necessarily mean that's where the activity is going to be. So there is a lot of work going on. There has a lot been done already, but it's not all the same. There are a lot of public perceptions of impacts. All fracturing isn't the same, but what we tend to see from the media and other ones, and it's not really picking on the media or picking on the public, but it is confusing. I was down at a conference on climate change in Montreal, and there's a nuclear power engineer who saw these people standing in ads for hydraulic fracturing holding these big balls and figured that was profit. So he thought we were making fractures that were 4 or 5 inches in diameter or size, when we're really using grains of sand. Those balls are things we drop in to control the staging and fracturing. They're not profit. But if you're not in the industry, you don't realize that. So a lot of people pick up on things that really aren't applicable to all types of fracturing. Other things like producing tons of toxic chemicals, all these ones are things that come up in the media. We all get down to the bottom and say the perceptions of Albertans, people in Alberta, are not as radical. And that's a good thing from both points of view. First of all, the questions we get from people in Alberta are more knowledgeable because they know more about the industry in the first place. But they're also more relevant to things that are actually important. So we don't get maybe as much flack on things that aren't important, but we do get flack appropriately on the things that are important. As far as public perception, there are a lot of regional sensitivities. We had people talking about drilling in Lethbridge, and that was a big problem. People drilling in the Arctic, people don't seem to worry about that for a different reason. It's a different group of people. So again, in Alberta, we have a lot of different regions that are producing a lot of different types of fracturing formations. What's being done in any region is different from what's being done in the region next door. So most parts of Alberta are used to oil and gas development being nearby. There's not very many parts of the province that don't have some history of oil and gas development. Other regions with less historic activity are being suddenly inundated, and they're not sure what to expect. Even in the southern part of Alberta and the Lethbridge area, there hasn't been a lot of oil and gas activity down there in the past for conventional. So even in Alberta, we have regions where there wasn't much oil and gas activity before. Also, environmental and socioeconomic needs are different. So there's towns dying because the conventional oil industry has been dying off. So places like Drayton Valley are happy to be growing again. They're all of a sudden seeing activity after years of decades of almost nothing. So from going to projecting that their town is going to die, now they see the town being rejuvenated, and they want to understand that. Beaver populations are booming. Don't worry about them. There's lots of them out there. Except caribou are being stressed because we've got different activities going into caribou areas than we had in the past because of hydraulic fracturing. There's a lot of overlapping uses between oil and gas, logging, or agriculture. Maybe that's okay. Coal-bed methane wells tend to be on agricultural pasture land. That's a lot different from the boreal regions. And then overlap of other uses like oil and gas and recreation. Recreational users really get upset when there's a builder near their park all of a sudden. So there's some areas that seem to be off limits, other ones not necessarily so. If you look at a specific formation like the Cardium tight oil, which we have a project going on through PTAC, we looked at a sample of 200 wells from that. The carrier fluids are have changed even in a few years from mainly oil to mainly water. The energizing fluid use is nitrogen. It reduces the amount of water use, so how much nitrogen use affects the amount of water. The proppant is sand. There's a number of different issues there. I don't have time to go through all of them, but right now we're doing about 75% of the sample we're done with slick water fracturing, which is mainly with water. That uses about 2,600 cubic meters of water per well. That's a lot different than some of the numbers you'll read in media, and I'll talk about that a little later. But very few chemicals. Slick water doesn't use very many chemicals. So you have a trade-off. You can do fracture jobs that have a lot of chemicals, or you can do fracture jobs that use a lot of water. Which one would you prefer? And if you're in the Peace River region or the North Saskatchewan region, they aren't that water constrained. Nitrogen enhanced, you can use nitrogen to reduce the amount of water. About 25% of the wells were done that way. You need only 500 cubic meters of water per well. But then you're having to use nitrogen. So that means nitrogen trucks all over the road bring nitrogen from someplace. And a lot of tons of nitrogen. Oil was originally used for a lot of the fracturing. It's being used less. But a lot of people are still using it. And then there's potential fracturing water demand. If you look at the amount of water that might be used for potential fracturing in the Cardium, it's a lot less than the produced water that's floating around right now out there for conventional after it. So in one part of the Cardium, there may be 5 million cubic meters of water being produced and reinjected every year. And that's a lot larger than anything that's going to be used for hydraulic fracturing. So we're already managing a lot of water in that area. Hydraulic fracturing is just another use, another way of using it. If you look at the Duvernay, there's another one a lot of people talk about. And again, it's at the bottom list, so not a lot of activity yet. There's still a very small number of wells. They're distributed over quite a large area of the province. They pretty much use all water for their carrier fluids. They don't use really any energizing fluid. They really have to use premium proppant because they're down deeper. They have to hold the formation apart, thus pressing in harder. Most producers are using about 15,000 to 20,000 cubic meters of water per well, but there's some of them been up above 125,000 cubic meters per well. That's a lot of water to truck it in. 50,000 cubic meters of water is maybe 2,000 truckloads. So that's a lot of trucks going into one well site. We multiply by 10 wells on that site. That's a lot of trucks for a long time, just hauling water. But there really hasn't been a lot of clear pattern. So far there hasn't really been a good pattern emerging of what the Duvernay commercial development is going to look like, because a lot of wells have been developed in the area. If you look at well production profiles, wells produce very high rates for maybe 6 to 12 months. They have rapid decline. Everybody knows this stuff. But they do get stable EURs. They get sustained production at low rates, but we don't know for how long. How long are these things going to be maintained as economic? And the facilities, we have to handle that huge surge of flow for the first year, and then after that, we don't need it. So how do we do things really with that? As far as predicting the future, and this is where the complexity really comes in, and a lot of the issue is around how many wells and what type of wells and where are they going to be. That's the big unknown. Each individual well you can look at and say that's the environmental impact, but which one do we multiply by 2 to 10,000? So when you start drilling thousands of these wells, which formation is going to be drilled and fractured the most? Where is it going to be located, and what are you going to use while you're doing that? Because obviously the Duvernay, the Cardium, and coal-bed methane are quite different. So are we going to be drilling 10,000 coal-bed methane wells or 10,000 Duvernay wells? Has a huge impact on where it happens, who it happens to, and what the impacts are. So it's a major problem, and even for companies when they're planning their economics, they have problems trying to figure out what the economics of that are. because this is still new stuff. They don't get to look back 10 years or 20 years and see what the history is of the formation, because they're making it. So when you're looking ahead, it's very hard for companies and investors to know exactly what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the reserves are. So you look at, again, we're so new in this, we don't really know how to calculate reserves for these unconventional resources yet. So there's a lot of potential in refracturing wells. People in the States have been going in and refracturing wells they fractured before and maybe getting incremental production. There's potential for applying secondary and tertiary recovery. We already have producers in the Cardium that are going in and doing water flooding and talking about doing gas flooding of the horizontal fractured wells. We don't know what the results of that will be. There's also people like Shell and ExxonMobil that are looking at converting hydrocarbons, organic matter, into resources into oil and gas, heating that up. We don't know what the impact of that is going to be. So it's very hard to tell what the reserves are. The reserves are what's technically and economically recoverable. There's huge resources, but there may be very little reserves up there. And it's reserves we really need to focus on, because that's what's going to be developed. That's what's going to cause the impact. And a key lesson there came from California just recently. The government dropped the estimate of recovery of reserves in California Monterey field by 96%. So imagine everybody's planning on a number that's huge, and all of a sudden it's 4% of what it used to be. So all of a sudden your plans change a bit. Okay? And the impacts of infrastructure, trying to figure out how to do this. There are futures for tight oil formations. There's a lot of potential for water flood enhancement, like I mentioned. There's potential for gas EOR. There's potential for co-development of underlying Duvernay. One of the other issues we have is we have the Cardium sitting up relatively shallow, the Duvernay's underneath it. Two totally different formations, totally different fracturing in the same area. So how do you communicate that to people locally about what's going to happen? It's very difficult. Some companies get good leases, some companies get bad leases. The resource is all over the place, but it's not the same. So this is just for 3 companies that are in the same formation, producing essentially the same type of wells. This one, they're drilling a lot of wells, getting this amount of gas. This is the same scale for all of them. So this one's not getting as much gas as this one is, but they're drilling a lot more wells to get it. They're the same number of wells to get it. This one's getting the same amount of gas with half the number of wells. So in trying to predict the future, which one do you go on? Which one do you assume is going to be the future case? Are you going to get more production out of fewer wells, or have to drill a lot of wells if they're bad performers? This shows the same thing for the poor and the best companies. The poor companies, they're going to have a hard time being economic even at $6 a gigajoule. Whereas some of the ones with the better leases, they can be economic at $2 a gigajoule. So gas price has a huge impact on how development happens, how fast it happens. You can't develop if there's no economics in doing it, or if there's no market for the gas. And of course, gas production prices are a big variable that is affecting everybody, but especially in Alberta, trying to forecast what world gas price is doing. I teach oil and gas property evaluation. I show my students this, where the gas prices converged globally because of LNG, and then all of a sudden we got in here with economic downturns, Russians setting the gas price based on oil, and Japanese. The earthquake in Japan had a huge impact on gas prices because the nuclear power plants were shut down. So all that had to be replaced with LNG in Japan. So what's the future going to be? Your guess is as good as mine. So whenever you see a price, take that with a grain of salt. But obviously if it's down here, we're not going to be doing a lot in Alberta. If it's up here, we might be doing a lot in Alberta. So how do we plan for that when we don't know where we're going to be? So how does Alberta hydraulic fracturing complexity in Alberta compare to other jurisdictions? The activity is happening in more and more varied resources and diverse landscapes, wider range of methods, issues, and options. And that's where what type of well and where it's going to be is going to be a huge factor. The focus is more on tight, shallow oil and liquids, not gas. More competition for markets both within Alberta, between all our resources. We have people in Duvernay will be competing with people in Montney and people in the COVID methane fields. Which one's going to win? We've got one market. We don't have enough market to have all those developers as they like. More competition for markets, more stringent and all-encompassing regulations. We've heard about those. I think we are one of the best places in the world to be doing this. Other places are a lot worse. Policies have to shift from conventional to unconventional, but also from the fact that Alberta used to think somebody would buy anything we could produce. Now we have to compete. And they'll take the cheapest stuff they can get, so that may not be enough. But the key thing, even though this is an environmental discussion, the focus is still on economics, and our big challenge is trying to predict how many wells are going to be drilled, because you look at the impact of each well, are we going to be doing 100 of them or 10,000 of them? That's a huge factor, and that's being driven by economics. And until we understand the economics and the reserves, we really will have a hard time assessing the environmental impacts of these technologies.